What's going on, Habibis? It is Keeping It Halal for Friday, June 19th, 2020. I'm Siraj Hashmi. Happy Juneteenth to all the Habibis who are currently celebrating or observing this holiday. Want to get into the top of the top story right now that everybody's focusing on is this Trump rally that's going to be happening in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Now, for those who aren't familiar, my folks lived in Oklahoma City for about 5 years from the span of 2005 to 2010. My Bubba, Fayaz Hashmi, doctor, heart surgeon, he was in Oklahoma City for those 5 years, set up a private practice, and I learned a lot about Oklahoma and my time there. Of course, at the time I was in college, so I only spent summers and winters there in between semesters. It's a great state. I mean, I actually really enjoyed living there. I found a great community of Pakistani Muslims, or American Pakistani Muslims, because let's be honest, they were all born there, or at least all my friends were born there. Um, but here's the thing. So Trump was originally supposed to host this rally on Juneteenth today. Um, and while Juneteenth was originally it was originally recognized in Texas, in Galveston, Texas, it commemorates Union Army General Gordon Granger announcing federal orders in Galveston, Texas on June 19th, 1865, proclaiming that all people held as slaves in Texas were free. Okay, so this isn't like the end of slavery altogether, just in Texas. Of course, it's now being observed in now 47 states in the U.S. There's been significant push to make it a federal holiday, and I think for me in particular, seemed very appropriate, obviously, to hold a rally on Juneteenth, given the fact that President Trump, obviously, he's up for re-election, and I think there are obviously moral reasons for why he shouldn't hold a rally, considering the fact that it's a holiday celebrated by many people in the Black community, and I mean, I think for a lot of people, it's. I think a lot of people probably try to claim that they knew about Juneteenth before this year. I think I learned about it first, um, a little bit, maybe about a few years ago, and it has always been a holiday I've been trying to, I've been reading up more and more on. I think when I started seeing it in media, I think seeing it in entertainment in shows like Atlanta with Donald Glover. He has an episode entirely focused on Juneteenth and going to a Juneteenth party. And I think he and his girlfriend, they're trying, like his girlfriend's trying to make an impression on her boss, whose house they're invited to. And her husband, so her boss is a black woman, black businesswoman, and her husband is a white guy, I think, trying to be too woke. And I'm trying to remember the entire premise of the episode, but that's obviously not that's besides the point. Essentially, when it comes to Juneteenth, obviously you can understand the sensitive nature of Trump holding a rally on a holiday that's observed by many in the Black community, and the how you say the reputation that President Trump has sort of given off to many in the Black community, one who's being one who's been accused of being racist, the one, I mean, we've seen out in the open his handling of the Charlottesville riots in 2017 that resulted in the death of one protester, Heather Heyer, all surrounding the topic of Confederate monuments and statues. And I'll get into Confederate monuments and statues and just statues in general in a little bit because there's still a lot going on. But with respect to this Tulsa rally, there are a few things. Obviously, one, you have coronavirus cases going up around the country, in a number of states, Oklahoma being one of them. Tulsa is obviously becoming a bit more of a hotspot. I think the focus has been a lot on cases and not so much on hospitalizations. Still waiting on more numbers for hospitalizations, but obviously we were going to expect a second spike in coronavirus because of the reopening of the economy. And while Trump may not do a nationwide shutdown for coronavirus, you can imagine that there are going to be some governors, particularly Democratic governors in big states like New York, maybe Michigan, certainly places like California, even Virginia, where I am, ones that are held by Democratic governors who probably have a bit more disdain for President Trump and his administration, wanting to throw a monkey wrench into his whole economic progress by shutting down their respective states. Can totally see that happen. Florida is interesting because in the last few weeks, at least in the last week, we've seen cases go up. And there was a time in which cases were going down and it looked like everything was in the clear. Now, Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, certainly looks like he's got a little bit of egg on his face. The whole Florida beaches thing that everyone was talking about, including me, during the protest, nationwide protest after the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. No one's hands are clean in all of this, and that's the unfortunate side. There's no moral high ground you can really pick a side and say we were right, you were wrong. No, everybody's been at least a little bit wrong in every way, shape, or form. And it's sad because people are dying as a result. Now, this rally in Tulsa, there's a lot of concern about it because there's obviously at the moment that I'm recording this, it's indoors for one. From what we know right now, the level of spread of coronavirus in an indoor facility that's not properly observing social distancing measures. People aren't wearing masks, which is this rally is allegedly supposed to be going for, which again, I don't know because the rally hasn't happened, but that's been the talk. Okay. Just want to highlight one particular tweet. So Fox News reporter John Roberts, White House reporter, covers the president. He tweeted out this afternoon on Friday, responding to the question, "Are you going inside?" He said, "Yes, I will be going inside with appropriate precautions. It's like digging a slot trench to sleep in every night during the invasion of Iraq. You take all the necessary steps to keep yourself safe." I don't know about that, but that sounds like that's coming from a Fox News reporter, okay? And I know John Roberts is actually a fair, pretty even-handed reporter, pretty fair. I don't know if you want to equate going into a rally, a political rally, with the risk of coronavirus being spread to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Think of how much we're still in Iraq for the record. We haven't left. We had a resurgence of ISIS, or a rise of ISIS, and then a defeat of them. But you had insurgencies. You had toppling of Saddam. You had a lot of Americans and a lot of Iraqi civilians die for, at least in my mind, a very unnecessary war. So now you're starting to think, how necessary is holding this rally to begin with? We all know that coronavirus impacts the older population a lot more. Think of the people that are going to this rally, obviously not everyone attending a Trump rally is above the age of, say, 80 or above the age of 65. But those people who are going to be at that rally are going to be subject to some level of risk. And yes, everybody is subject to a number of risks in life. You just got to weigh the risk with the reward. And that's what a lot of protesters did during the massive unrest after the death of George Floyd. People were wearing masks, yes. Were they practicing social distancing? No, not really. You can see footage of it. You can see just in the last weekend in Brooklyn, you had a Black Trans Lives Matter rally, and there was a sea of people there. Sure, they may have been wearing masks, but were they practicing social distancing? No, not at all. And the fact that we were talking about how New York has become the biggest hotspot in the country for coronavirus cases, tens, I think it's now a little, last time I checked, which was earlier this week, there have been over 17,000 deaths. In fact, let's check it now. Okay, so as of June 19th at 1 p.m., there have been over 17,546 deaths from coronavirus, confirmed deaths. Over 54,000 hospitalizations, and almost 210,000 cases. And they include probable deaths of coronavirus. Cause of death reported as COVID-19 or equivalent, but no positive laboratory test. They put that number around 4,600. So that's, if you include confirmed deaths as well as probable deaths, that you're looking at 22,000 people in New York alone. That includes Brooklyn. It's not like Brooklyn's not part of New York City, part of New York State. Anyways, so obviously that's a big deal. But there was another aspect to the Tulsa rally that didn't get talked about nearly as much and was brought up quite a bit in the last week or so before Trump averted this crisis of his own making and switching the date of his rally from June 19th to June 20th on a Saturday. And the reason why this has been coming up so much, I'm talking about the 1921 Tulsa race massacre. And for those who aren't familiar with this, this is like one of the most violent acts of racist terrorism happening against the Black community in American history. Happened almost 100 years ago. And all involved, it started with essentially with essentially what happened was in the Greenwood district of Tulsa, it was known as Black Wall Street. It was one of the most affluent Black communities in the country. And what started it all, like most incidents of racist violence that we've seen in our past, similar to Emmett Till, you had essentially a Black man being accused of assaulting or looking at a particular white person funny. In this case, the massacre began over Memorial Day weekend when 19-year-old Dick Rowland, a Black shoe shiner, was accused of assaulting Sarah Page, the 17-year-old white elevator operator of the nearby Drexel building. Okay, I'm just reading this off, okay? He was taken into custody. Dick Rowland was taken into custody. And then a subsequent gathering of angry local white people outside the courthouse. They essentially gathered where Rowland was being held. And then rumors spread out that they had lynched Rowland in an extrajudicial killing. outside of the judicial system. Okay. This alarmed the black population in the Greenwood district at Black Wall Street. And essentially, some of them arrived to the courthouse armed. So now you have a confrontation between a group of angry white people and now a group of angry black people, and they're both armed. Obviously, you could tell that's a recipe for disaster. And it's not reported. I'm not seeing essentially who opened fire, but shots were fired. I'm saying I don't know who opened fire first, but shots were fired and 12 people were killed, 10 of them white and 2 black. And then as news of this confrontation of these deaths of these 10 white men and then the 2 black men it went throughout the city, then essentially mob violence broke out. Just an onslaught on Greenwood, on Black Wall Street. White rioters rampaging through black neighborhoods that night and morning, killing men and burning and looting stores and homes. And it wasn't until the next day around noon that the Oklahoma National Guard managed to get control of the situation by declaring martial law. This all happened in the span of one night. Even a private aircraft was involved in essentially destroying 35 square blocks of the district. They dropped bombs and incendiary devices from this airplane. And as a result, the death toll was an estimated anywhere between 36 dead, where 26 of them were black, 10 were white, up until 300 dead. And they can't even confirm that because they were going to have they had actually, this is almost 100 years later, mind you. And this is crazy because, and I'm going to get into why this is so crazy, but essentially they had, according to article I read in the New York Times, really well done, a revisiting of the burning of Black Wall Street by Brent Staples, who was a member of the editorial board, does a really good job of sort of laying out what happened. And essentially, they had covered up how many people actually died, because obviously at this time, this is 1921. You had groups like the Ku Klux Klan running rampant, and essentially they were insipid, or they have almost completely assimilated into sort of the hierarchy of society. So, they were part of they're cops, they were lawyers, they were judges, they're store owners, small business owners, you name it, doctors. Essentially what happened was they covered up all of this. And they were actually, just this year, they were going to start excavating 2 possible mass graves in Tulsa, Oklahoma, from what they thought was from the Tulsa race massacre. Even the craziest part about this is that the 1921 Race Riot Centennial Commission had been in existence up until 2018 before changing their name to the 1921 Race Massacre. 2018, that is 97 years later. And I'm not gonna lie to you, I'm a pretty big history buff. I really like learning about history. I had not heard anything about the 1921 race massacre in Tulsa. In high school, in college, maybe because I was a bio pre-med major in college and I didn't have the chance to learn that, although I would have really liked to. And now really regretting, obviously not learning as much history as I'm trying to learn now. But there, it's disappointing, obviously, because you start to hear so many more stories um, about things like the Tulsa Race Massacre in 1921 and where everyone was. Why wasn't this covered? In fact, what's the most obviously one of the more harrowing parts of the story is the fact that 10,000 or about 10,000 black people were left homeless from living in Greenwood. Property damage amounted to more than $1.5 million in real estate and 750,000 in personal property, which is equivalent to today of over $32 million. That property was never compensated for and was never recovered. Even to this day, there was a failed federal lawsuit against this particular incident. And this was happening they sought restitution from the Tulsa, they sought restitution from the Tulsa race riot initially, now the Tulsa Race Massacre in 2003, and it was an unsuccessful federal lawsuit to get restitution from the city and the state. And there are so many parts of this story that just, they tear at your heart because you think that we Americans will never do this to one another. This is during the Jim Crow era. This is obviously, it's post-slavery. You can't think today, like, no one can be that racist. Like, no one can have such a racist society or a racist town in which truly people who are not sharing your skin color are considered second-class citizens or subhuman or inhuman. And essentially, they had covered up this story so much that even the police had cordoned off the entire district and wouldn't allow anyone to go in and take photographs of the damage that had been caused without police permission. Think of that. Like, you don't have a free and functioning press unless you have the police essentially give you the green light to take photographs or even accurately report on it. So one particular part that shows that they actually covered this up, they covered up the body count and that there are actually more than 36 confirmed deaths, in which 26 of them were black and 10 of them were white, is that there was a local historian by the name of Ruth Sigler Avery, and she actually got an account from one of the teenagers who had witnessed a grisly killing of a black man he was handicapped. He had his legs amputated. He was selling pencils, and then he sang for change, for money. And essentially what happened to this man, and he was blind as well. He's blind and he was selling pencils, and he was killed. This is a man who he wore baseball catcher's mitts to protect his hands from the pavement as he scooted along the wheeled wooded platforms of Tulsa. Okay? He was shredded alive behind a fast-moving car. He was dragged to death, which has happened to countless black people. Essentially, one of the witnesses to this killing of this blind black man was a teenager by the name of E.W. Maxey. and he was an undersheriff of Tulsa County by the time he recounted the carnage to the local historian Ruth Sigler Avery. And this is about 50 years after. So we're looking at 1971 by the time we're hearing him recount this scene. He recalled that the victim was, quote, hollering. His head was being bashed in, bouncing on the steel rails and bricks that lined the street. That's the type of violence we're looking at here. Like, I obviously hate to get into such like gory and grisly detail, but like, in order to like understand how people view, like systemic racism today, like you don't have to go back very far. This is not even 100 years ago. And I mean, like, obviously you have Emmett Till, but like this is happening to like ordinary people, like a couple, maybe a generation or two removed from us. And yeah, a lot of us are privileged in the sense that we've never had to see or experience or be there for a family member who has gone through with it or gone through it or a friend who's gone and experience and had these horrible experiences. We simply can't. I mean, we have, for someone like me, I have no idea. But the thing is, like, we have to really, I mean, we have to know our history for one. And I encourage, at least if you're listening to this, do a little bit more digging on the Tulsa Race Massacre from 1921, because it's truly one of the saddest things to learn and read about. And obviously, I feel very sad and frustrated that this was something that wasn't really taught in schools, at least in the comforts of my high school and college. But again, like, this is based on my own personal experience. I guess it's better late than never, right? So, but the reason I'm talking about history is because now we need to talk about some of these statues that are being torn down. And usually I try to focus in on why, there's misinformation or why there's disinformation or straight up propaganda. And I think in order to at least understand where some of this misinformation or disinformation comes from, again, you have to just learn history. So this week in Portland, Oregon, a statue of George Washington, the nation's first president. He was the commander of the Continental Army, or the general, I should say, of the Continental Army. His statue was torn down, and it was spray painted on, essentially, vandalized, and essentially is being grouped in with a number of Confederate generals, soldiers, what have you, Confederate leaders who have had their statues torn down and removed. President Trump in 2017, during his pretty abysmal handling of the Charlottesville riots in August of 2017, correctly predicted that if they're going to tear down Confederate statues, where are they going to draw the line, right? Are they going to draw the line at Washington or at Jefferson? They own slaves. It's true. They own slaves. And you're starting to see that happen now, almost 3 years later. And I think we at least need to, focus in on the fact that George Washington, while a very flawed individual and very flawed, in some ways, very flawed leader, politically speaking, because he had the opportunity to speak out against slavery and he didn't. And he owned slaves, and he has a very complicated relationship with slavery. And I feel like we give him a pass for sure. But I think when you look at sort of how things have sort of transpired since, you have to look at the legacy that they leave. And while, yes, George Washington will be judged, in my view, he'll be judged by God for his, the things that he's done in his life. it's not like there hasn't been religious justification for owning slaves. I mean, for example, in Islam, it's pretty well documented that slavery was being practiced by Muslims, and there was a religious justification for having slaves. Certainly in Christianity. I mean, Judaism is interesting because there isn't, I don't believe there is, you don't have that to the same extent because the Israelites were basically slaves. And then the Jewish religion sort of came about when they fled Egypt and fled Pharaoh. But interestingly enough, I mean, Confederate symbols deserve a particular amount of scorn because when we talk about history, and history is told by the victors, so very rarely does the loser get a seat at the table in terms of writing history. You don't really get that with the Confederacy. In fact, the Confederacy is maybe one of the only examples, at least in my mind, of the time when losers actually got a seat at the table in writing history. In fact, their narrative is probably a little bit more dominant than not. But you also have to recognize, you can draw a line here and say that the Confederacy arguably made this country worse. It's true. They fought for the institution preservation of slavery. They fought for the continuation of using black people torn from their homeland, essentially uprooted. My friend Barrett Holmes Pittner uses the term ethnocide, in which you strip the people's culture away and keeping the people. Genocide is you kill the people and you kill the culture. And ethnocide, you kill the culture but you keep the people. And essentially what happened was with slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, you killed the culture of these African slaves and essentially turned them into people who had to sort of develop their own culture out of their own because they were so far removed from their culture back home. The Confederacy arguably made this country worse through the preservation of slavery. You can't really say the same about George Washington because ultimately, at the end of the day, his deeds, his good deeds at the very least, in founding a nation in which they could build a legislative resolution to ending slavery, was for the better. And I say that knowing very well his early skepticism to slavery was purely for economic reasons initially. It then developed into being sort of, even if he was privately, morally opposed to slavery later in his life, from like witnessing a slave auction and not wanting his slaves who are being sold to have their family broken up. Even with those private sentiments of being morally opposed to slavery, he never made any public statements about it. Never made any anti-slavery public statements about it. And as historians have said, the reason for that is George Washington believed that he was concerned that slavery was too divisive for such a fragile nation as ours. And he thought that talking about slavery and abolishing it would threaten national unity. Which, okay. I had never lived during that time. Obviously, you can see me here now in 2020. I don't know. I don't believe in reincarnation. So I don't know if I ever actually lived during that time. That being said, look, I think those are going to be one of the biggest things that you can look at Washington and say, yeah, he messed up. He should have said something when he had a platform, he had a moral opposition to it, and yet he chose to not threaten national unity, and he chose to keep slavery intact, to preserve national unity. And I don't know. I honestly, that's a very um, that's a tough thing to sort of justify. I don't see any reason how anyone could. I think it's a complicated issue, and when it comes to statues, sure. Do I think there should be statues of people throughout history, knowing very well that they're flawed individuals? Maybe we shouldn't have built statues of people to begin with. I mean, in Islam, if you think about the reason why Muslims in particular are a bit more radical on imagery of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was because of the potential of vandalism or defacing, but also because of the respect that Muslims have for the Prophet Muhammad. And it's only a matter of time before people, go back in history and see that, slavery, for example, is even more prominent in the Muslim world, as I just said before. The Prophet Muhammad owned slaves. He freed slaves, but he owned them too. In fact, the Arab slave trade exported over 17 million slaves from Africa to different parts of the world, namely the Indian Ocean, the Middle East, and North Africa. Slavery wasn't abolished in places like Saudi Arabia until 1962. And the only reason they abolished slavery is because the British basically pressured them into doing it. And while while most countries in the world have slavery abolished, you know, there are some countries that don't have it. It's slavery is more an underground part of our society now, in the sense that it's more taboo, but in some way, shape, or form, in places like Mauritania, which is in North Africa, slavery is still legal, and people would pass them off as just being, say, workers. I mean, you even look at, say, the type of modern day slavery we see in places like Qatar, and you have a number of foreign laborers and foreign workers essentially being held against their will to complete these massive stadiums for the 2022 World Cup. And you're having hundreds of workers and laborers die. And these are people from like the subcontinent, from Nepal, from India, from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, I think from Myanmar too. And this was a huge story back in like 2014, 2015, but no one talks about this anymore. Look, when it comes to defending statues and our heritage, I think there's a saying that you'll never be woke enough. And I'm of the belief that when it comes to Confederate statues, we should take them down in an administrative way and put them in museums so that people can learn about them. I think Diane Alyssa, I don't know her last name, but that's her on Twitter, out in Houston, Texas. She made a really good point about how people know about the Holocaust in Germany, but they don't have statues of Hitler, gracing parks left and right. I think that's a very strong argument, and you can't find justification for why, say, a Confederate statue should be still up. Put them in museums. Let people learn about them. I'm tired of the Confederacy ruining the United States today. It hasn't been around since the mid to late 19th century. What was it, like 1865, 1868? When did the Civil War end? Yeah, the Confederacy existed for 4 years, from 1861 to 1865. How is it that they're still ruining American society today? It makes no sense. People want to relive these glory years. Like, there hasn't been anyone anyone alive today was not alive during this time. During, I think the last person who received a Veterans Affairs pension check, who was the daughter of a Civil War veteran, died within the last month at like 110 or something like that. Like, think about that. Their parent fought in the Civil War. It's crazy. In any event, look, there's a lot to be said about Confederate statues and, conflating statues and where we should draw the line. And as I said before, you'll never be woke enough. One day it'll be Confederate statues, the next day it'll be statues of U.S. presidents. I've even made mention that the statue of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who is an arguably one of, at least in the not in the 20th century, if you look at, say, like Woodrow Wilson and FDR, probably the two worst presidents of that century. FDR interned hundreds of thousands of Japanese Americans. And while he led us through the Second World War, he was weak and feckless to the Soviet Union and sort of allowed them to sort of position themselves as being this great superpower. And that set up the Cold War. I had made the suggestion that FDR should have his statue torn down. And I think we can look at each individual president on the basis of their merits and whether they should have a statue. Of course, like some of these presidents today now get presidential libraries. I wonder what President Trump would do if he is given the opportunity to construct a library. I imagine he would just make a huge skyscraper just because that seems to be his MO. But before I wrap this up, I wanted to make one particular point because Trump is in an interesting position given the fact that it's an election year. And he, if he really wanted to, he could say make Juneteenth a federal holiday. He could, while he issued an executive order on police chokeholds with some wiggle room, that basically said if the police officer's life is in danger, they can use a chokehold. Essentially, when you look at how he has been approaching issues of race and how he's done, in some ways, not a great job. Some of his supporters will say you have historic low black unemployment. You have criminal justice reform. You have, and through the First Step Act. And then you have I think that's that's it. I can't think of anything else off the top of my head. But even then, with Trump, he is not really vying for the black vote so much as he's vying for the white suburban vote. Because for white people, and again, I'm biracial. I'm at least half white, so I at least can speak from a point of authority here. There is a tendency for people, particularly white people, to not vote for someone they think is racist. And white people, out of all races, have the most antipathy towards other white people, especially if they feel that they don't share their views, say on things like race. You don't get this with any other race, by the way. Generally speaking, there is sort of a there's sort of a cohesion among different racial groups that they speak more highly or more favorably about people of their own race. Like I find it with, say, Muslims. It pains me, obviously, to criticize any other Muslim or any other brown person or any other Pakistani because you feel like you're in it together. You feel like, your back's against the wall sometimes, like you're one of the only few people in like a sea of people who are not like you. And essentially, that's what gets people to sort of band together. You don't get that with white people. And Trump is the white college educated vote is going to be huge for Trump in 2020. And he has to get them to turn out and vote for him while also trying to get as few black people out to vote for Joe Biden. I mean, if you think about that, that's crazy. Essentially, Joe Biden is now looking at two black female politicians to be his running mate. You got Senator Kamala Harris. You got Senator Kamala Harris and Congresswoman Val Demings. Despite the fact that both of them are black women, they're both cops. And during a wave of nationwide social unrest and protests after the killing of George Floyd by a police officer, and also Breonna Taylor, again by a police officer, choosing between two cops, it's pretty tone deaf. I don't know what went into the calculus here. I feel like at the same time, while Biden knows very well he's not going to get much of the progressive vote through Bernie Sanders or base, I think he's factoring in that he's trying to get people on the fence, people who are independents, who think that Democrats are all are Democrats by and large are saying all cops are bastards or they're all anti-cop. I don't know. We'll see. Final decision has not been made, and we'll see what happens on that end. But of the choice of what I'm hearing from reports from Biden's camp, all he has to do is not say anything. Trump is actually Biden's best shot of winning the election. And I say that meaning that Trump, just by doing his job or tweeting about stuff or getting into Twitter beefs or, posting memes and stuff, making himself looking to be unpresidential in some way, shape, or form, that helps Biden. And we're seeing it reflected in the polls with a widening lead for Biden. Now, whether that actually continues to stay, we'll see what happens. This is a different situation than 2016 because in 2016, people were like, oh, there's no way that Trump would become president. Hillary's going to completely sweep. And people underestimated how much they hated Hillary. And what you ended up getting was depressed voter turnout, even though there was you get depressed voter turnout in places where Hillary needed the vote. And then you had a sort of a surge of voting in places where, like California, where she had like a huge advantage there. And while she had the popular vote, she didn't get the electoral college vote. And I think you're not going to see that this time around, despite the fact that Trump could still win this thing. You can't write off Trump at all. And we're very far away we're less than 5 months from this election. And there's still a lot that can happen. We haven't even factored into who Biden will pick and how that will reflect in the polls. You could imagine that some people are racist enough or sexist enough that they'll ditch Biden and either stay home or vote for Trump or vote third party because they don't want, say, a black woman to be a heartbeat away from becoming president. Sucks that everything comes down to race, but racism seems to be the hot thing today. Anyways, Habibis, that's all I got for today. That's been Keeping It Halal. I'm Suraj Hashmi. I'll see you next time.